Bruchko by Bruce Olson. Chapter 19. Everyday Miracles. It seemed a miracle that the Multilones had accepted Jesus at the Festival of Arrows. A song of praise filled my heart for days. Then I heard news from the other Festival of Arrows. The words Bobby had sung had been repeated there and had been accepted joyfully. It was almost more than I could believe. As people began responding to the word and obeying God, other things happened that I also called miracles, things that were clearly supernatural. But the Multilone idea of a miracle wasn't necessarily mine. Something that astounded me they took in stride. Medicine, for instance. After the Motilones began to walk with Jesus, there was a tremendous expansion in that field. But whenever shots, pills, or ointments were administered, they were accompanied by a chant that called on Jesus to heal. For the Motilones, the healing that the medicine accomplished was a miracle from Jesus. It was something he did for them. Their prayers were a part of healing process. Sometimes that brought surprising results. One day I arrived at a home to find a man who had been bitten by a poisonous snake the week before. He had almost recovered. "I thought you were out of snake antivenom," I said. "Where did you get some?" "We didn't have any," the witch doctor replied. "What in heaven's name did you do to make him recover?" "Well, all we had was some antibiotics, so we gave him that and prayed that God would heal him. And as you can see, he did." I was astonished. The antibiotic was absolutely no good for snake poisoning, but God had healed the man, not the medicine. But that wasn't what the Multilone said about all healings. What difference did God's method make? Whether a person used the proper medicine or not, it was still his healing. But I was glad that God chose to work in visibly powerful ways among the Multilones, if only to show me that he was really changing their hearts. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for me to believe that almost total acceptance of the gospel on part of the Multilones. Sometimes I would think, is this really true conversation, or is it just one more legend for the Multilones to draw on? Then God would let me see the powerful changes in their lives so that I could not doubt that he was working in and through them. One day I returned from a trip to find that Atabacodoria had been brought in with a fractured back. He had fallen from a tree during a monkey hunt. We had no facilities for helping him there, so we carried him over trails for 3 days and floated him downstream with him to the hospital in Cebu. They x-rayed him there, and the doctor said that he had a broken neck. He would have to lie perfectly still for months. Because I was the only person who spoke to both Spanish and Multilone, I was to relay this news to him. Atabacadora was lying on his back in bed. They had put supports under him so that his back curved up in the middle. He was uncomfortable. The nurses, he complained, wouldn't let him move. "The doctor just told me that you would have to lie still for 3 months," I told him. "If you don't, you will never get well." "No, Bruchko," he said. "I can't do that. I can't lie here that long." "Atabacadora, you have to. If you don't, you won't get well." I named him and promised to obey the doctor's orders, but he wasn't happy about it, and I wasn't sure how long his promise would last. Bobby and I discussed it, but neither of us thought of a solution. He might lie quietly for a week if he really tried, but 3 months? Impossible. "Look, Bobby," I said, "sometimes the man who knew Jesus when he walked the trails would anoint a sick person with oil and pray that he would be healed. I think maybe we should do that with Atabacorodora." "And does it work, Bruchko?" Bobby asked. "Does God heal in this way?" "I don't know, Bobby. I've never tried it." I didn't have much faith that it would really help, but I knew that Atabacadora would never be able to lie still for 3 months, and I couldn't stand the thought of seeing him crippled for life. We got some oil and went into his hospital room. He was in pain. The sedatives weren't having enough effect, but he still smiled at us. "We want to pray for you," I said. Bobby dipped his finger in the oil, and I did the same. We stood there for a moment. Bobby was waiting for me to go ahead. "I don't know where to put the oil," I said. "Somewhere in his head, but I don't know where." "Let's put it on his forehead," Bobby said. We did that and then put our hands on his head. Bobby prayed. "God," he said, "Atabacadora has a backache. He needs to be well again so that he can run the trails and fish and hunt with his brother Motilones. You can make his backache go away. We want you to do that, and we ask you to do it in the name of Jesus." We said a few more words to Atabacadora and left. I had some business in Cucuta, and I put Atabacadora's in Bobby's hands. The business took 3 days. I spent most of them worrying about Atabacadora. When I got back, I immediately went to Bobby. He was annoyed. "Atabacadora won't even try to stay still, Bruchko," he said. "He says he's uncomfortable lying on his back and he won't stay flat." We went to the hospital room to see him. His bed was empty. I was alarmed. Had he hurt himself by moving around and been taken to the operating room for surgery? Then Atabacadora walked into the room. When he saw us, he got a guilty look on his face like a child who's been caught stealing cookies. Quickly, without a word, he got into bed and made a show of lying correctly, with his back curved up in the middle. He had no sooner assumed this pose than a red-faced nurse came in and behind him, huffing. Pointing at him and sputtering, she reprimanded me loudly for letting him get out of bed. Atabakdora lay quite still, with a beatific look on his face. When the nurse finally left, threatening all kinds of evil, he grinned. It was my turn to scold. Atabakdora, don't you care about getting well? If you don't lie still, you may never be able to hunt again. He pouted. Bruchko, I just couldn't stay in the bed any longer. It was uncomfortable. I did what you said for 3 days, but that was enough. Bruchko, Bobby said, if he doesn't have his backache anymore, why should he stay in bed? I hadn't thought of that. I found the doctor and asked him if he would take another x-ray at Vatabactorum. He didn't want to, but I wheeled him into it. All right, he said, if it'll make you happy, I'll do it. The next day he came up to me with a puzzled look. Is that the same Indian you brought in originally? Of course, I said. Do you think we play checkers with your patients? Well, if it is the same man, his back is mended. It's quite amazing. There's no sign of even a hairline fracture in his back now. It's some kind of miracle. Boy, he said, I want to find out what his exact treatment was. I've never known our treatment to be so effective. I laughed. Don't you think that there was something more than medicine working here? Like what? He asked. Like God. He went off shaking his head. I was tremendously elated. I found Bobby and told him what happened. Bobby, do you realize that it's a miracle? Bobby wasn't excited. To him, it was just a backache that God had healed. Lots of people got backaches, lay in their hammocks for a day, then got up and went about their business. This one was a little worse than usual. But Bobby, I said, the x-ray showed that his neck was broken. What's an x-ray? Well, I can't explain that, Bobby, but the point is that God healed him. But Bruchko, why is that a surprise? We have seen too many people healed to be surprised at it anymore. In 1967, about a year after the first Motilones had become Christians, Arabadoikoya and a small group of other men came to talk to me. They had decided that they wanted to tell the Yuko Indians about Jesus. I had the same desire earlier and had made a trip back to the Yuko village where I had spent nearly a year. I hadn't been there more than an hour before I saw something that had changed. I soon discovered what it was. One of the women who I tried to tell about Jesus when there was the first time had a vision. As a result, most of the village had accepted Jesus. They had given up the chica, the drink which they had gotten drunk on so often, and there was a noticeably different quality of life in the village. Instead of telling the Yukos about him, as I set out to do, they told me about him. However, I was surprised that the Motilones wanted to talk to the Yukos about Jesus. The two tribes had been bitter enemies for years. The Yukos had a game where they liked to play. They would braid the long 5-inch jungle thorns and lay them on the Motilone trails. They would hide in the brush and wait. When a Motilone ran along the trail, he would step on the thorns. The Yukos would laugh at his agony and run away. Now Motilones wanted to tell Yukos about Jesus. At that time, they didn't understand that there were languages other than the Motilone language. They thought the Yukos spoke just as they did, but the languages are totally different. I couldn't see how they would manage to communicate anything about Jesus. But I wasn't going to try and restrain them. I suggested that they go to the lowland tribes who hadn't heard about Jesus. A few days later, they left. I prayed that it wouldn't be a shattering experience for them, and God would comfort them in any disappointment at being unable to communicate. They were gone for several weeks. When they got back, I went to see Arabadakoya, curious about what had happened. How did it go? I asked. He was making arrows, and he looked at me with his familiar crooked grin. Wonderful, he said. They had not known about Jesus before. And did they understand? Oh yes, we told them many great things about Jesus. You spoke to them? Of course. Arabadakoya was a little concerned about my surprise. How would you have told them? Oh, in the same way. But how do you know they understood? Again he looked perplexed. Why had they told us what they told us that they did? They were very excited to hear the news, Bruchko. You mean you opened your mouth, spoke to the Yukos, and they understood you and talked to you, and you understood them? Yes, of course. The Yuko language is not a dialect of the Motilone language. It is a totally different language. You can never understand one from knowing the other. Yet I am sure that Arabatakoya and the others were not lying. Lying is almost unknown among the Motilones, and they had no reason to lie. There is also a fact that there are now Christians in the Yuko lowland where there were none before. I can only conclude that God's Holy Spirit made the Motilones speak and understand Yuko. It was a miracle to me, but to the Motilones, everything that God does is a miracle. I have learned with the Motilones to expect God to provide what we need, regardless of circumstances. On one occasion, where we were fighting a measles epidemic, I ran out of drugs. Measles were one of the deadliest diseases for Indians, and without antibiotics, I was helpless. There were already 10 cases of measles, and it was spreading fast. I felt sure that God would provide the drugs somehow. I never doubted that, even though I had no funds in the bank, no credit. I went to Tibu, sure that there would be some money. I opened all my mail. There wasn't a cent. I still felt that God had an answer to the problem. He had before in similar circumstances, and his spirit was comforting me about this particular case. I went into Cucuta, opened my post office box there, and found a check for $500. It didn't shock me. I merely said, "Thank goodness it's come." I cashed it, then bought the medicine I needed. The bill came to $565. "I have $500 here, and if you wait, I'll pay the rest," I told the clerk. He agreed. It was a big sale, and he didn't want to pass it up. The day before I left Calcutta, I checked the post office box again. There was a check for $100. I paid the drug supply house's money and had some left over to buy a good meal and some things I would need in the jungle. The drugs were enough to stop the epidemic and control its complications. The greatest miracle I have seen, though, has been the changed lives of the Motilones. They have found their purpose in Jesus Christ. As a result, they have broken down the individuality that prevented them from helping each other. There is real caring for the others, real self-sacrifice. That has made their economic development possible as well as their spiritual development. Without the without it, their programs always bogged down. With it, their problems are being solved. I've spoken before the United Nations. I've spoken to the Organization of the United States. I have been a personal friend of the last 4 presidents of Colombia. My experience with the Motilone Indians has taught me to deal with other cultures, how to promote positive change without tearing social structures apart at the seams. I try to share those things, but the most important thing that I can say to those who want help to primitive people is this. They will not be helped very much unless they find purpose in life through Jesus Christ. Without him, whatever development takes place always will be twisted or corrupted. It will embitter those who try and hold it together, and those who don't care about it will be ruined by apathy and alienation. But with Jesus, there can be real change, not just spiritual change, not just change by and by. Real change now with visible power. He is the source of all change. He is the God of everyday miracles.